Hello, my name is James Arroyo, and welcome to Chapter 9, Managing Conflict in Relationships. We've previously discussed how we develop and manage relationships. Now we're going to be discussing one of the primary tensions in all relationships, and that is conflict. And there may be some preconceived notions about conflict that we already have that are only making conflict worse. So, we're going to better understand it and then learn how to manage it more effectively in relationships. Let's dive right in. So, why is it that we should learn about productive conflict? First, we will have better relationships with people. We will, if we are better able to address and manage conflict, then conflict will be less likely to have persistent detrimental effects on the relationship. We also have the idea that, obviously, conflict is unavoidable. There will always be conflict. So, when we better understand how to use it and how to understand it, then we'll be able to better address it. And having productive conflict helps solve problems that as we will talk about, we are not going to have a person orientation regarding conflict. It's not that person is the problem. There is a problem that we can both solve, and we both have to work together to solve. So let's talk about what it is. Conflict is an interaction between two or more interdependent people who perceive they have contradictory goals or scarce resources. First of all, an interaction between two or more interdependent people, meaning that what one person does affects the other, but also that we depend on each other for some sort of goal. So, the second part of this is we perceive they have contradictory goals and scarce resources. The perception of it may not be the reality. Also, the contradictory goals, meaning that, for example, either we watch Game of Thrones or American Idol, we cannot do both. Those are contradictory goals. Also, scarce resources. What do we do with our time? Do we go to Taco Bell? Do we go watch a movie? Do we go bowling? We only have so much time, we can't do all of them, so the scarce resource of time is something we may have conflict over. So, we manage it. Conflict management is the way that we engage in conflict and how we address disagreements. So, something to keep in mind with conflict is that it is inevitable. It is impossible to avoid conflict, so we should therefore strive to handle them effectively. And we handle them effectively by using constructive conflict styles instead of destructive conflict styles. Destructive conflict style is about defending myself, using evaluative you language. You language is very much saying that it's making a value judgment that you did this, you are this, you are responsible for this. But what it does is it doesn't take responsibility for my perception of things and says that outside of my perception, you did this. Also, along with this, we have low empathy, a lack of care or understanding or regard for the other person. And that can lead to a lot of destructive aspects of relationships, even outside of conflict. We should always regard other people and have empathy for others. And lastly, and what are the results of this destructive conflict style? It can have result in poor mental health and even physical health. There's been studies to show that lymphocytes do not proliferate as much just simply due to the stress that destructive conflict style cause. So, what should we do instead? We should have constructive conflict style. Conflict is healthy. This perspective understands that conflict is healthy and needs to be faced. And perception checking is used. A perception check is a process. It is description of a certain behavior, interpreting finding one or two interpretations of this and presenting them to the other person, and then off asking for input from the other person. This shows a regard for what the other person thinks, as well as allows them the ability to negotiate this meaning instead of me making an evaluation of it and then that is the meaning without negotiation from you. We also have to be willing to admit mistakes, because we always make mistakes. We're only human. And by taking even a little part of the problem, then therefore it's not a me versus you situation. It's us kicking around the ball together, trying to find a mutually satisfying conclusion. And the constructive conflict style results in relational harmony. And here's the best part, even when a result isn't reached. So even if we do not get an outcome, it still improves relational harmony by communicating in a way that shows regard for the other person, creates negotiation of meaning with the other person, and overall shows empathy and care for the other person. So obviously it'll improve relational harmony. Now let's talk about what causes conflict. There's many things. First, inaccurate perceptions. If someone perceives someone's actions as a slight against them, or somehow maybe even being dishonest, that may not be the actual what the other person meant to send. It may have been due to situational factors, but as we know, we tend to have a um, fundamental attribution error where we tend to overestimate internal causes versus external factors or external situations. We also have incompatible goals, and that is something that can happen. Guess what? Only one person can get the job. Only one person can win the football game. So there are some times where incompatible goals can happen, but we tend to make that determination far quicker than maybe we should, because there are a lot of times win-win scenarios that both of us can get exactly what we want. Also, unbalanced costs and rewards that, as we've talked about with social exchange theory, if the rewards outweigh the costs of a relationship, the relationship will be fine. But if the costs outweigh the rewards, then the relationship will inevitably dissolve. And a big reason for that is because conflict tends to emerge more often. And this is a good thing. This is good that this conflict arises, because that helps negotiate meaning, communicate challenges with the relationship, and due to communication in general, but conflict in total in this specific situation, we are then able to find and reduce some of these costs and maybe increase some of these rewards for each other. Then we have provocation, or the intentional instigation of conflict. And this is where we get into troll territory, where we get Willy Wonka. That what sometimes happens is when someone's feelings get hurt, then they may intentionally instigate conflict to then hurt the other person. So there are this can very much lead to an escalatory cycle regarding conflict. There are many events that spark conflict. First, just aggression from the other person then can spark conflict. We also have identity management. Someone communicating a lesser evaluation of my identity, or an identity that I don't see myself as, can obviously instigate conflict. We also move into lack of fairness. If something's not fair, then there will probably be conflict about it. Also, incompetence and not being able to communicate effectively, and we can end up creating escalatory cycles due to communication incompetence. And lastly, relationship threats. Um, Someone cheats, that's going to spark conflict. And now we talk about many factors. There are many factors that affect conflict. First, power dynamics. power dynamics are absolutely going to shape conflict. Think about how you engage with in conflict with your younger sibling, with your older sibling, with your parents, with your friends, and even if ever there's a chance with me. There are different powers, and therefore we will engage with it differently, maybe acting more deferential or even less deferential and more straightforward regarding how much, whether someone has more power or less power, respectively. Also, we have attitudes about conflict. When we have negative attitudes towards conflict, we're more likely to avoid conflict altogether and even take conflict personally, both of which can escalate the conflict situation because it is a lack of regard for the other person. What better way to say that you don't matter or I don't care about what you have to say than to avoid the conflict situation entirely? We also have communication climate. The feeling of what communication feels like with a certain person or group. There's uncertain communication climates where there are vague goals and no one really knows what either person wants. A lot of times this is due to sort of the idea that it's like showing your hand in a game of poker, and you may be able to get more of what you want if you don't share your goals. But this also diminishes the overall communication situation because you might be able to get a win-win scenario where we both get what we want. And we have defensive communication climates. And this is where people feel threatened through, and this is communicated through mistrust, apprehension, or suspicion. This is very much like those crazy reality TV shows like Big Brother, if anyone's seen it. And we should strive for a supportive communication climate with honesty and consideration. But how do we get there? Well, we have defensive climates. Defensive climates involve being open minded, suspending judgment, giving the benefit of the doubt, and being problem oriented, not person oriented. A lot of times, the reason why we have defensive climates is because we feel like the other person is the problem instead of the problem being the problem. And by taking in some of the information, listening to the other person, that creates a reciprocal response. When the other person feels like they're listened to, then they will start listening as well, and therefore building a supportive climate. And being problem oriented, focusing on the problem versus the person, that makes it so that, again, we are kicking the ball around. We're working on the problem together versus that the other person is the problem and I must beat them into submission to then get what I want. We also have uncertain climates. And uncertain climates, the best way to transfer this into supportive climates is by focusing on the task, being open to discussion, to talk about it and understand it better, asking for help, and this is an important one, being assertive. When a lot of times, I don't know about you, but I have a hard time sharing what I want from a situation because I don't mind. I don't mind not getting what I want in some situations. But because I'm not being assertive, that can end up diminishing creating an uncertain communication climate because the other person may want to give me some of what I want, but they don't know what I want. And therefore, that can create a conflict. There's more factors. Culture is a big one. Wait, culture affects everything? Of course it does. We have individualistic and low context cultures. They tend to see conflict as as necessary to problem solving. Specific issues, these are separate from the relationship. Whereas collectivistic high context cultures tend to see conflict as tend to see it as having a negative effect on relational harmony and that it is and is therefore undesirable. We'll talk a little bit more about this, but in general, when we know that there's someone from a collectivistic culture who we need to engage with conflict in, we should strive to be more welcoming and supportive and develop relational harmony while while discussing this conflict situation. And sex and gender, men, this is on average, men tend to are less likely to voice complaints and criticisms. Men tend to stonewall more, that is to avoid the situation, whereas women tend to criticize more. And that leads us very nicely into the four horsemen of the apocalypse. The four horsemen of the apocalypse are toxic conflict styles. These four horsemen ride together and they spell the end of days for relationships. These, in some way, shape, or form, communicate a lack of regard for the other person and therefore diminish the relationship in its entirety. First, we have criticism. This is attacking the partner instead of dealing with the problem. This obviously communicates a lack of regard because it's literally attacking the other person. Then we have defensiveness, and this one is just as destructive. This is playing the victim. And if I am the victim, then what does that say about the partner? That they are obviously at that point the villain. So, when we self victimize, it's in essence saying that I am the helpless victim. I have no part in this problem. And since there's a problem that exists, therefore it must be you who is entirely the problem. So, we want to avoid that. Also, we have contempt. This is attacking the other person's self worth. And this is incredibly horrible because by attacking the other person's self-worth, that almost certainly will create an escalatory cycle, but also it will, when it attacks the other person's self-worth, then it overall just diminishes the relationship. And then lastly, we have stonewalling. Stonewalling is just being unresponsive, but still feeling emotionally charged. This is the general idea of, you know what, let's just hold off. Don't antagonize or don't or him or her. You know what? American Idol's going to be on soon. At that point, then he or she can't touch me then. So all of these feed off of each other and can lead to many problems. Last two factors, I promise. We have channel. A poor choice of channel can influence and increase conflict. Text. Text is a horrible place to engage with conflict due to the leanness of the channel, meaning the lack of nonverbal cues. So the audience may not understand that you may mean something sincerely instead of, and maybe they may perceive it as antagonistic. Then we also have online anonymity. And online anonymity is that they don't know who we are, and this can lead to certain challenges such as flaming, deliberately hostile toward one individual, trolling, provocative, offensive messages to incite a general reaction, and then cyberbullying. This is persistent bullying in an online channel. This can engage with both flaming and trolling, but overall, very negative. And the big challenge regarding cyberbullying is that it is persistent even outside of school or wherever they are meeting. So it is something to keep in mind that with this online anonymity, it's very easy for people to fall into these challenges of destructive conflict. And we should avoid them. So now let's talk about what is your conflict style. In general, there are 5 conflict styles, and each has a particular situation which it is most effective. But we also tend to lean towards one type. Doesn't mean that we can't engage with all of these different types of conflict styles, but we tend to lean toward one or two in most cases. This involves, and this is all based on 2 dimensions: concern for yourself, meaning my goals. If my concern for myself is high, then I care a lot about my goals, whereas I don't care that much, then it's low concern for the self. Versus concern for the other, that I want them to get their goals, and in a high concern for self situation versus concern for others, that would be low. Um, Low concern for others, that'd be I don't really care whether or not you get what you want. And based on these dimensions, we're going to be discussing these 5 conflict styles as well as some of the um, intricacies surrounding them. We start with avoidance. This is low concern for the self, low concern for the other. This is a lose-lose scenario, and it's very much taking the caricature of the turtle that we hide in our shell and not deal with it. That we would rather suffer in silence rather than confront the problem in its entirety. This um, this doesn't solve the problem, and it can actually escalate the situation. As I've said before, what is more aggressive, what communicates more of a lack of regard than to avoid a conflict situation that they want? This is more frustration and discomfort in relationships, or can lead to these when avoiding is chronic. However, doesn't mean that it shouldn't be avoided in that avoidance should be avoided all the time. There are applications when it could be useful. When a conflict isn't worth it, or even when emotions are out of control, it might be a good idea to take a second. Hey, you know what? Let's avoid this for a second. We'll come back in about 10 minutes, or maybe we'll come back to this tomorrow and we'll further discuss it. That's the avoiding conflict style, but it can be useful to have tempers cool. Next, we have the accommodation style. This is low concern for the self, but high concern for the other person. This is a lose-win scenario where I lose, but you win. This is your way. And it's like, I like to think of it as the caricature of the teddy bear. It is, if it is genuine act of kindness or love, then it can enhance relations. That's great. But it is not appreciated when this style is used to take the role of the martyr, the bitter whiner, or the saboteur. Instead, when someone says, you know what, you go ahead and have the TV. You always get what you want. You know what, I'll just sit in the dark and not watch TV, I guess. That is obviously not appreciated. Avoidance and accommodation can have different meanings that are culturally bound. In collectivistic high context cultures, they may engage in avoidance or accommodation just simply to avoid the conflict in total. But when over engaged with, then that can lead to relationship deterioration. So we have to understand that the cultural expectation of their culture is to avoid or accommodate, and that we have to find ways to make them win as well so that we can preserve the relationship. Then we have competition. Competition is high concern for the self, but low concern for the other. This is a win lose. This is the caricature of the shark. This competitive nature is ingrained within the American culture and can be used to develop a shared narrative around competition that can be very positive, that we should all strive for better and better and better and continue to strive for self-improvement. However, this can obviously backfire into hyper competitiveness, where it is that if I win, you have to lose, and that can obviously cause a lot of challenges across the organization or the relationship just simply due to a lack of regard for the other person. This can also lead to destructive conflict styles or destructive behaviors like passive aggression. When a communicator expresses dissatisfaction in a disguised manner, we know what it is, but the reason why people do it is to engage in crazy making. This is where I try to make you feel crazy so that you'll feel so bad that you'll just give me what I want, or that because I've lost or won, or because I've lost in general, that I'm trying to make the situation so uncomfortable for you that you'll give me what I want. And then we have direct aggression, and this is attacking the position and dignity of the receiver. This is pretty obvious, but it's something that is reflective of a competitive conflict style. Then we have compromising. This is mid self, mid other. This is where we have middle concern for the self, middle concern for the other. This is in the middle of those squares. And is it a win-win? Is it a lose-lose? That's a little bit hard to say, because it isn't so much a win-win, because it's not that we both got what we wanted or a little bit of what, it's that we got a little bit of what we wanted. And that's not satisfactory. So we should, however, settle for compromise when partial satisfaction is the best that can be hoped for. And sometimes that is the case. Compromise tends to have an unearned positive reputation, though, that when there really is no um, intelligence involved or discussion involved of compromise, it is just simply, you get half of what you want. Kind of like the age old proverb of, you can't decide whose baby it is, cut the baby in half. No person is really going to get exactly what they want, but it is instead talking about and if it is satisfying for both parties, then it would be much better defined as collaboration. And collaboration is high concern for the self, high concern for the other. And this is a win-win, and treat it like the wise owl. The win-win problem solving is finding solutions that satisfy the needs of everyone involved, and is the one that we should try to strive for most, especially if the conflict, we want both people to win. Avoiding trying to succeed at the other partner's expense is a way to engage in collaboration, and a belief that working together will allow both parties to get what they want without compromise is vital to this collaborative effort. This leads to less aggressive communication and less stress for all parties, but this collaboration style is becoming more and more rare because we have a very competitive nature. In fact, American culture is unique in its hyper competitive perspective on things. So we want to be sure that we are avoiding that and trying to engage more in a collaborative nature, because that tends not to be our natural inclination. Collaboration is ideal, but it is also time consuming. So this basically leads to the idea that every style has its application. We've talked about how avoiding has its time. Compromising also has its time when we can't get to collaboration. Competing has its time when maybe it's a crisis situation and there is no time to discuss what the right course of action is. Instead, I have to say this is what we're doing, and I'm not listening to you anymore. And that can lead us to productive ends. Or accommodating, where, you know what, hey, you want my candy bar, I kind of want my candy bar, but you know what, I don't actually want the candy bar all that much. You have it, please. Actually, you're doing me a favor. At that point, all of these have different, each of these styles has its own time and place, but we tend to gravitate toward one, and it's a good idea to try to flex the muscles of other styles that maybe we aren't so used to, so that we'll be a more rounded, competent communicator. So there's some understandings we have to understand while managing conflict. First, healthy debate and argumentation is essential regarding constructive conflict. By engaging in probing questions and even playing devil's advocate, that is vital for conflict, so that we have multiple perspectives. And when we understand the other person better, we're communicating a regard for them, but we'll also show an understanding of their perspective in the solution, so that we can reach these win-win scenarios. Also, emotional expression. We have to be able to disclose our feelings, because if we don't, and if we are, I mean, it's impossible to just hide our feelings. We'll end up showing them in some way, shape, or form. But by being honest with our feelings, we won't have a blow up. Also, passive aggressiveness, as we've discussed, indirect accusations or procrastination, those are passive aggressive tendencies, and can and are very much reflective of this competitive conflict style, which can be negative in some situation, or and especially passive aggressiveness, that can absolutely be negative in all situations. That doesn't solve anything. Third-party help is seeking unbiased person to mediate. That reduces the relational context and therefore allows for us to come to the right conclusion and reduces a lot of the relational context so that meanings can change. So sometimes if we cannot reach a solution, then reconciliation is the best that can be hoped for. Asking for giving an apology if it gets out of hand, admitting wrongdoing, and taking responsibility for your role in the conflict involves metacommunication. And this can turn a destructive conflict style into a constructive conflict style by engaging in some metacommunication, which is communicating about our communication. You know what? I yelled a bit too loud, and you know what? I got a little bit heated, and I really shouldn't have done that identity attack on you. I really do apologize. I didn't mean to, and I just let my emotions get the best of me. I hope you can understand. By doing something like that, it allows for the other person to then give a little bit as well, and that we can preserve the relationship so that a destructive conflict doesn't persist to the next conflict. And then we also have forgiveness. If you are the wrong person who is who wrong has been done to, sometimes just letting go and moving on can help so that again that destructive conflict doesn't persist to the next conflict. There are many conflict outcomes. Compromising is trading a random selection. Either, you get this time and then I'll get it next time. Random selection, let's flip a coin. Both of those can be outcomes for it. We also have win-win solutions. Lose-lose. Win-lose. Separation entirely, that's when destructive conflict gets the best of us and we just separate. We no longer have a relationship anymore. And that's probably one of the worst. Then we have allocation of power. And this happens with all conflict. But as we know, with a more nuanced perspective of conflict, just because you get what you want doesn't mean that you have gained power in that situation. Allocation power is your ability to influence another person. So let's say that you use destructive means to get what you want, and you have identity attacked, and you have crazy made, and you have engaged in passive aggressiveness, and you eventually got what you want. Are you now going to have more influence on that person due to that conflict situation? Probably not. Actually, you'd probably have a lot less power over them. So, when we engage in conflict, we have an allocation of power, and one person probably will end up getting more influence over the other. But that obviously depends on how conflict is conducted, not who won, who got what they wanted. There's a more nuanced perspective on that. So, how do we manage it in practice? First, the first step of any conflict is to define your needs by sharing what, and then to define your needs for yourself. What is it that you actually want? Sometimes that is a little bit more challenging than we think. Sometimes it might not even be the thing that's the problem. For example, when me and my sister were fighting over the remote for TV because we only had one TV, and um, we couldn't agree on what to watch. Therefore, it could have been about the remote, but it really wasn't about the remote. It was more about the fairness that I didn't get to watch TV all this time, but she got to watch it all that time. So therefore, I wanted equitable time. That's what the problem was, not who gets the remote in this situation. Also, share your needs with the other person. Choosing a suitable time and place for it, not sometimes that's not in the moment and instead maybe after the moment has occurred. Using I language instead of you language. As we've said, you is an evaluative statement, whereas I language is taking a responsibility for my perspective of things and then sharing that perspective. Then listen to the other person's needs. That's vital so that you understand what they want so that you're able to find a win-win scenario. Generate possible solutions, evaluate possible solutions, and choose the best one. This is just random, general problem solving. Then implement the solution and then follow up with the solution. And this last part is vital because if we do not follow up with the solution, what ends up happening is that someone could not be living up to that solution, and therefore feedback has to occur for for both of us to be on the same page in this conflict management situation. That concludes this chapter on conflict. Have a wonderful rest of your day. I'll see y'all next time. Bye.